Her hands, now empty, remembered the warmth of the one who was no longer there. The rain hit the window like tears she could no longer shed. The silence of her house was an endless echo of absence, until the sea whispered a secret to her. In her eyes, the light she thought was lost shone again, when a pearly conch shell and a green-eyed stranger taught her that some storms bring unexpected treasures. If this story touches your heart, gift us a like as one caresses a wound that begins to heal, and comment, how do you think this story of rebirth will end? The sea breathed heavily that afternoon, as if the Caribbean waters were conspiring with Alma Vega's troubled thoughts. From the window of her small house on the coast, she contemplated the horizon that was gradually darkening, just like her hopes. She was 32 years old and had the feeling that life had passed her by like the waves she now observed, repetitive, constant, but leaving nothing tangible on the shore. The saline humidity seeped through the wooden cracks, impregnating every object in that place which, after 6 months, she still didn't feel was hers. The walls, decorated with shells and black and white photographs, seemed to belong to another person, to another life, perhaps to the one she had imagined having when she decided to abandon everything and take refuge in that small fishing village. Alma ran her fingers over the scar that crossed her left forearm, almost imperceptible now, but eternally present in her memory. It wasn't a war wound or from some spectacular accident, just the physical memory of a childhood lived among broken glass and sharp words. Her father had never raised his hand against her, but his indifference had been just as lacerating. Silence also cuts, she whispered to herself, as the wind began to beat harder against the windows. The local radio announced the arrival of a tropical storm, nothing out of the ordinary for the season, but enough to keep fishermen on land for the next few days. Alma pressed the small pearly conch shell that she always wore around her neck against her chest. She had found it the day she arrived in Puerto Corral, half buried in the sand, like a secret about to be revealed. Since then, it had become her talisman, the only constant in a life full of uncertainties. The first drop hit the glass with the force of an omen. Soon, hundreds more followed, transforming the landscape into a diffuse watercolor where colors mixed without defined borders. Alma closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The smell of wet earth mixed with that of the rough sea, creating a primitive fragrance that reminded her of origins, of the essential. It was then that she heard that sound, barely perceptible among the roar of the storm. A knock, then another. Someone was knocking at her door. The man who appeared before her when she opened the door seemed to have been sculpted by the same storm. His dark hair clung to his angular face, and his eyes, of an intense green, contrasted with the paleness of his skin. He wore a soaked shirt that adhered to his body like a second skin, and in his hands he held what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. "Excuse the intrusion," he said in a deep voice, marked by an accent that Alma couldn't identify. "My boat has been stranded on the North Beach. I saw your light from the coast." Alma hesitated for a moment. In the 6 months she had been in Puerto Corral, she had built a routine based on chosen solitude, in silence shared only with the sea and with the seagulls that flew over her roof every morning. Strangers were not part of that carefully calculated equation. "There's a shelter in the town," she responded, pointing south, where the lights of Puerto Corral flickered weakly through the curtain of rain. The man followed her gesture with his gaze, and then fixed his eyes on her again. There was something in his expression that momentarily disarmed Alma. It wasn't pleading or desperation, but a mixture of dignity and weariness that she immediately recognized, as if she were looking at her own reflection. "I won't make it to the town in this storm," he said simply, and then, as if he had read her thoughts, added, "I don't bring problems. I just need shelter until it subsides." Lightning illuminated the sky, projecting for a second the man's elongated shadow on the wet sand. Alma felt the shell on her chest warm slightly, as if it were whispering a message she couldn't quite understand. "You may come in," she heard herself say, stepping aside, "but only until the storm passes." The man nodded and crossed the threshold with cautious steps, as if he feared breaking something invisible. As he passed by her, Alma perceived an aroma of saltpeter, mixed with something deeper, more earthly. He smelled of distance traveled, of untold stories. "My name is Gabriel," he said, placing the wrapped bundle on the worn wooden table. "Gabriel Lanza." "Alma," she responded, dryly, without offering her surname, as if by doing so she would be giving away a part of herself she wasn't willing to share. Gabriel carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing what appeared to be ancient scrolls protected by a worn leather case. Alma observed how his hands, rough but surprisingly delicate, caressed the material with reverence. "What is that?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Gabriel looked up, and for the first time, a shadow of a smile crossed his face. "My past, and perhaps my future," he responded enigmatically, covering the scrolls again. "Sometimes what we seek is right where everything began." The night advanced slow and heavy, as if the storm had altered not only the landscape, but also the flow of time. Alma had prepared mint tea in 2 uneven cups, the only courtesy she allowed herself to offer her unexpected guest. Gabriel had changed into dry clothes that she had left on a chair for him, garments forgotten by some former inhabitant of the house, and now contemplated the rain from the window with a stillness that was almost hypnotic. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather like a neutral space, an unexplored territory where both could exist without the expectations that usually accompany conversations between strangers. Occasionally the creaking of wood or the whistling of the wind interrupted that shared calm, like small reminders that the outside world still existed. "Have you been living here long?" Gabriel finally asked, turning towards her. Alma raised her gaze from her cup, where she had been observing how the mint leaves danced in ever smaller circles. 6 months, she responded, and then, as if she wanted to balance the scale of that strange intimacy, added, "And you? What are you doing sailing these waters during storm season?" Gabriel took a sip of tea before answering, as if he were calibrating the exact weight of his words. "I'm looking for something I lost a long time ago," he said, "at last. Or perhaps something I never really had." There was something in his voice, a peculiar cadence that suggested stories buried under layers of time and distance. Alma recognized in it the echo of her own searches, her own ghosts. "The inhabitants of Puerto Corral have a legend," she said, surprising herself by sharing what she had heard in whispers during her sparse interactions with the locals. "They speak of a reef, the Reef of Shadows, that only appears during certain moons. They say that in it dwell the memories we have decided to forget." Gabriel looked at her with renewed intensity, as if she had uttered the exact words he expected to hear. "Do you believe in those stories?" he asked, moving a little closer to the table that separated them. Alma played with the shell that hung from her neck, feeling its rough surface under her fingers. "I believe that each of us carries our own reef," she responded after a moment of reflection. "Sometimes under the skin, sometimes in memory." An especially violent thunder shook the small house, making the window panes tinkle. The light flickered for a moment before plunging them into complete darkness. Alma got up to look for candles, moving with the certainty of one who knows every corner of their space. When she returned with 2 lit candelabras, she found Gabriel leaning over his scrolls, studying them in the intermittent light of the lightning. The golden light of the candles drew new shadows on his face, revealing subtle scars that had previously gone unnoticed, a small mark next to his left eyebrow, another that slid down his jaw like a tiny river. "They're maps," he said without looking up. "Maps of the seabed of this region, traced by my grandfather almost 70 years ago." Alma placed one of the candelabras on the table and leaned over the scrolls. The lines, made with surprising precision, showed coral formations, depths, and sea currents. Small annotations in the margins, written in an elegant but almost illegible calligraphy, added an aura of mystery to those documents. "My grandfather was a marine biologist," Gabriel continued. "He dedicated his life to studying the Caribbean reefs, but in his last years, he constantly talked about a discovery that he never officially documented, something he found here in these waters." His fingers traced the map until stopping at a point marked with a symbol that Alma didn't recognize, a kind of spiral that seemed to continue indefinitely towards its center. "The Reef of Shadows," she whispered, suddenly understanding. Gabriel nodded slowly. "For science, it doesn't exist. For local fishermen, it's a legend. For my grandfather—" He paused, as if the words that followed had a special weight. It was an obsession that consumed him until his last breath. Outside, the storm intensified, turning the world into a liquid chaos where the boundaries between sky and sea blurred. Inside, under the flickering candlelight, two strangers began to recognize in each other the contours of their own unfinished stories. Dawn arrived stealthily, filtering through the scattered clouds that the storm had left as the only witness to its nocturnal fury. Alma woke up in the armchair, where she had fallen asleep with a light blanket over her shoulders that she didn't remember putting on. Gabriel wasn't in sight, but the half-open door and the distant sound of footsteps on the damp sand indicated where to find him. She wrapped herself in a shawl, knitted with wool in blue tones, and went out to the porch. The sea breeze, fresh and revitalizing after the storm, caressed her face like a morning greeting. In the distance, Gabriel's figure was silhouetted against the horizon, where the sun began to spill over the sea, turning the waters into a mirror of molten copper. She walked towards him, letting her bare feet feel the texture of the sand, now compact and cool. Gabriel was standing next to what appeared to be his vessel, a small sailboat of dark wood that the storm had dragged several meters inland. It didn't seem seriously damaged, just temporarily stranded by the whim of the waves. "Good morning," she said as she approached, surprised by the naturalness with which the words sprang from her lips, as if greeting a stranger at dawn were part of her daily routine. Gabriel turned, squinting slightly against the growing light. His face, now illuminated by the clarity of day, seemed younger and less severe than the night before. "The Esperanza has survived," he responded, affectionately patting the hull of his boat, "although I'll need help to return it to the water." Alma observed the sailboat carefully. It was smaller than she had imagined, barely enough for one or two people, but its elegant and functional design revealed the hand of someone who understood the sea and its whims. "The fishermen will return at noon," she said. "They can help you." Gabriel nodded, but there was something in his expression, a shadow of unease that made Alma add, "Are you in a hurry to leave?" The question floated between them like a seagull suspended in a current of air, still but in constant movement. "It's not hurry," he responded after a moment. "It's anticipation. The moon reaches its fullness tonight." Alma felt the shell on her chest seem to vibrate slightly, as if responding to a frequency inaudible to the human ear. "The reef of shadows," she murmured, remembering their conversation from the night before. "According to my grandfather's calculations and the local stories he collected, it only reveals itself during the full moon that follows the first tropical storm of the season," explained Gabriel, taking from his pocket what appeared to be a small brass compass. "Tonight the conditions will be perfect." Alma observed how the compass needle oscillated erratically, as if it were confused by some magnetic interference. Gabriel followed her gaze and smiled slightly. "Compasses always behave." "Strangely near Puerto Corral," he commented. "My grandfather believed it was due to magnetic formations in the seabed, probably related to the reef." A flash caught Alma's attention. Something in the sand, a few meters from them, reflected the light of the rising sun. She approached and squatted to pick it up. It was a fragment of coral, immaculately white, veined with blue lines that seemed to glow with their own light. Its edges, although eroded by water, were still sharp enough to cut. "Be careful," warned Gabriel, approaching. "Coral can seem dead, but it's still alive in its own way." Alma felt a prick on the tip of her index finger. A drop of blood emerged, so red against the white of the coral that the contrast was almost hypnotic. Instinctively, she brought her finger to her lips, tasting the metallic taste of her own blood. Gabriel took her hand with unexpected delicacy and examined the small wound. "Coral wounds are treacherous," he said, taking a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapping it around Alma's finger. "They can easily become infected." The warmth of his hands around hers created a strange intimacy, a momentary bridge between two islands of solitude. Alma withdrew her hand gently, not out of rejection, but due to the sudden vertigo that connection provoked in her. "I have a first aid kit in the house," she said, taking a step back, "and I should offer you breakfast before you continue with your plans." Gabriel picked up the coral fragment and studied it in the sunlight, turning it between his fingers as if it were a three-dimensional puzzle. "This fragment is not common," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "This blue coloration. My grandfather mentioned it in his notes." He looked up at Alma, and in his green eyes shone a determination that was almost tangible. "I think it's a sign," he said in a quiet voice. "An invitation from the reef." Alma felt a shiver run down her back. as if an invisible hand had traced a line from her neck to the base of her spine. She didn't believe in signs or coincidences, or at least that's what she had repeated to herself for years. And yet, the wound on her finger throbbed with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the sway of the sea. "Breakfast first," she finally said, turning towards the house. "Signs can wait until the stomach is full." Alma's kitchen was an austere but welcoming space, dominated by a large window that framed the sea as if it were a living painting. The shelves, made with woods rescued from old shipwrecks, held handcrafted ceramic plates in earth, and blue tones that seemed to dialogue with the exterior landscape. Everything in that space spoke of a simplified life, reduced to the essential. Gabriel observed in silence how she moved with natural efficiency, preparing coffee in an Italian coffee maker that whistled softly on the old gas stove. Her gestures were precise, economical, like those of someone accustomed to being self-sufficient. "Toast?" she offered, taking a dark loaf from a wicker bread basket. "Thank you," he responded, sitting on a stool next to the polished wooden countertop. "It's been a long time since I've had breakfast in company." Alma cut thick slices of bread and placed them on a grill directly over the fire, the aroma of the bread heating up mixed with that of the coffee, creating an atmosphere of domesticity that was strangely comforting for both. "Do you live alone on your sailboat?" she asked while spreading local honey on the already golden toasts. Gabriel nodded, receiving the cup of coffee she offered him. "For 3 years now," he responded. "Before, I had an apartment in Havana, near the Malecon. I taught oceanography at the university." Alma looked at him with renewed curiosity. He didn't seem like an academic, at least not in the conventional sense. His hands, weathered by the sun and salt water, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, spoke more of a man of the sea than someone accustomed to classrooms. "What made you change classes for solitary navigation?" she asked, sitting across from him with her own cup of coffee. Gabriel took a sip before responding, as if he were savoring not only the coffee, but also the weight of the question. "My grandfather's death," he said finally. "He left a void that the classrooms couldn't fill, and he also left these maps, with a note that said, 'What you seek is not in books, but where the sky and the sea meet.'" He paused, drinking more coffee, and then continued. "At first I thought it was the delirium of an old man, but the more I studied his notes, the more sense they made. He had dedicated his life to documenting the Caribbean reefs, but this one, the Reef of Shadows, was different. Not only because of its elusive nature, appearing and disappearing with the lunar cycles, but because of what it represented for him, a place where time and memory flow in a different way." Alma listened attentively, feeling how Gabriel's words wove an invisible bridge between their respective solitudes. "And what do you expect to find in that reef?" she finally asked. Gabriel put the cup on the table and looked at her directly, with an intensity that made Alma feel a tingling at the base of her neck. "Answers," he said simply, "or perhaps just the courage to accept that some questions will never have them." The silence that followed was dense but not uncomfortable, as if both were processing not only the words said, but also the many that remained floating between them, unspoken. "And you?" Gabriel asked after a moment. "What brought you to this corner of the world?" Alma felt the shell on her chest warm slightly, as if it were warning her. Talking about herself meant opening doors that she had kept closed for too long. And yet there was something about Gabriel, in his quiet presence and in his eyes, that seemed to have seen too much to judge, that invited her to lower her guard. "I was fleeing," she admitted, surprising herself with the raw honesty of her response, "from a life that no longer felt like mine, from expectations that were suffocating me." Gabriel nodded, as if he understood perfectly without needing more details. "The sea is a good place to reinvent oneself," he said. "It has no memory, only presence." "And yet you seek memories in it," Alma observed. A fleeting smile crossed Gabriel's face. "Perhaps because they're not my memories," he responded. "My grandfather's seem easier to face than my own." Alma recognized in those words the echo of her own story, how it had been easier to immerse herself in the lives of others, in the books she devoured each night, than in the closed chapters of her own past. They finished breakfast in a shared silence, each lost in their own reflections but strangely connected by the mutual recognition of their respective inner exiles. It was Gabriel who finally broke the silence. "I'd like to propose something to you," he said, leaning slightly forward. "Come with me tonight." To the reef. Alma felt her pulse accelerate for no apparent reason. "Why me?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by the invitation. "We barely know each other." Gabriel looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "Because your eyes have the same gleam as my grandfather's maps," he said with simplicity, "the gleam of someone who seeks something they can't name." The hours that followed breakfast passed in a strange dance of proximity and distance. Gabriel had returned to the beach to prepare his sailboat, helped by two local fishermen, who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Alma, from the window of her small living room, observed his movements while pretending to read a worn-out book of Caribbean poetry that she had found among the belongings forgotten by the previous tenant. Gabriel's proposal, to visit the mysterious reef together, floated in her mind like a bubble that neither burst nor settled. The rational part of her being told her it was madness to accompany a stranger on a nocturnal expedition based on old maps and local legends, and yet another part of her, perhaps the same one that had driven her to abandon her previous life, felt an almost magnetic attraction to that adventure. She closed the book and approached the small desk where she kept her few personal belongings. From the top drawer, she extracted a carved wooden box, so small it fit in the palm of her hand. She opened it carefully, revealing its only content: a silver ring with a green stone that changed shades according to the light. It was the engagement ring she had returned 6 months ago, along with all the promises and plans that accompanied it. She had kept it not out of nostalgia or regret, but as a reminder of her own ability to break chains, even those forged with the best intentions. She took the ring between her fingers, feeling its insignificant weight, and yet so loaded with meaning. Then, in an impulse that she herself didn't fully understand, she slid it into the pocket of her linen pants. She left the house without stopping to analyze her decision and walked towards the beach, where Gabriel was adjusting the last ropes of his sailboat, now gently rocked by the waves that had returned to their usual rhythm after the storm. "I'll go with you," she said, stopping a few steps from him. Gabriel turned, shielding his eyes from the sun with a hand. For a moment, he seemed surprised, as if he hadn't really expected her to accept his invitation. "Are you sure?" he asked, and there was something in his voice, a note of concern perhaps, that wasn't present when he made the initial proposal. Alma nodded, although certainty was probably the emotion furthest from what she felt at that moment. "There's something I must do first," she said, taking the ring from her pocket. She approached the shore, where the waves gently licked the sand, leaving an ephemeral lace of foam in their wake. She breathed deeply, feeling how the saline air filled her lungs, and then, with a fluid movement, she threw the ring towards the horizon. The sun extracted a last green flash from the stone before it disappeared under the waters, taking with it an entire chapter of her life. When she turned, she found Gabriel observing her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't curiosity or judgment, but a kind of silent recognition, as if he had just witnessed an intimate ritual that he perfectly understood. "Sometimes certain things must be returned to the sea," he said simply. Alma felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she didn't even know she was holding. "What time do we set sail?" she asked, deliberately changing the subject. "With the sunset," Gabriel responded, pointing towards the horizon. "The high tide will begin shortly after, and according to my grandfather's calculations, that's when the reef begins to reveal itself." Alma observed the sailboat, small but sturdy, swaying with the hypnotic cadence of the waves. Now that she saw it in its element, she noticed details that had previously escaped her attention. The name Esperanza, painted in blue letters worn by the sun and salt, the small amulets hanging from the mast, shells, feathers, a crystal that refracted light in all directions, the boards of the hull marked by scars from previous voyages. "You should bring warm clothes," Gabriel added. "Nights at sea can be cold, even in the Caribbean." Alma nodded, although cold was the last thing that worried her. What really troubled her was that sensation of being about to cross an invisible threshold, of entering unknown waters, not only literally, but also in a deeper, more personal sense. "I'll be ready," she said, and in her voice there was a determination that surprised even herself. She turned to return home but stopped halfway and looked back towards Gabriel, who was now sitting on the deck of his sailboat, studying his ancient maps under the golden light of noon. "Gabriel," she called, and when he looked up she asked, Why Esperanza? What do you really hope to find in that reef? Gabriel carefully folded the map before responding, as if he needed that moment to order his thoughts. It's not about finding, he said finally. It's about returning. Sometimes what we have lost isn't really lost, it just waits for us to remember where we left it. His words remained suspended in the air, mixing with the constant murmur of the waves and the occasional cry of the seagulls that flew over the coast. Alma felt something resonate within her, as if that phrase had touched an invisible string that vibrated with a forgotten frequency. Without saying anything more, she resumed her way to the house, aware that each step took her a little further from the person she had been and brought her closer to someone she didn't yet fully know, to a version of herself that waited patiently in the depths, like the mysterious reef. The sun began its descent towards the horizon, tinting the sky with orange and purple tones that reflected in the now calm waters of the Caribbean. Alma was on the small wooden dock that extended from the beach in front of her house, with a light backpack at her feet containing the essentials for the nocturnal expedition: a wool sweater, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a notebook with worn covers where she had been writing since her arrival in Puerto Corral. She wore her hair gathered in a loose braid, and her dark blue cotton dress swayed gently with the evening breeze. The pearly shell shone against her skin, as if it had absorbed all the light of the day to return it now, on the threshold of nightfall. She observed Gabriel approach with his sailboat, handling the sails with the skill of one who has made the sea his home. The Esperanza seemed to glide over the waters rather than sail on them, like a natural extension of the elements. "Favorable wind!" he exclaimed as he approached the dock, with a smile that completely transformed his face, softening the lines that the sun and worry had traced on his features. Alma responded to the smile with a shy gesture, feeling a contradictory mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She took her backpack and, when the sailboat stopped next to the dock, accepted the hand that Gabriel offered to help her board. The contact was brief but intense, like a static discharge that ran through her arm and settled somewhere near her heart. Once aboard, Gabriel indicated where she should sit to maintain the balance of the vessel while he prepared everything to set sail. "Have you sailed before?" he asked, adjusting the sails to better capture the evening breeze. "Only on large ferries, never on something so intimate as this," she responded, running her hand over the polished wood of the bench where she was sitting. Gabriel let out a soft laugh, barely audible over the sound of water against the hull. "Sailboats have personality," he said. "They're like living beings. You have to listen to them, understand their rhythms, respect their whims." As he spoke, his hands worked with precision, adjusting ropes, checking knots, in a dance synchronized with the elements that revealed years of practice and devotion. "The Esperanza is especially sensitive," he continued. "Sometimes I think it has its own will, that it takes me where I need to go, not necessarily where I want to go." Alma observed how the dock and the coast gradually moved away as the sailboat entered. Open sea. Her house became smaller and smaller, until it became a white dot barely perceptible against the greenery of the coastal vegetation. It was strange to see her refuge from that distance, as if she were contemplating her own life from a completely new perspective. The sun finally touched the horizon, extending a golden path over the waters that seemed to invite them to follow it to the end of the world. Gabriel adjusted the course, orienting the sailboat towards the west, following that luminous wake. "According to my grandfather's maps and local stories, the reef is located about 2 miles from the coast, in an area where underwater currents meet, creating an almost imperceptible whirlpool on the surface," he explained, pointing towards an indeterminate point on the horizon. "Fishermen avoid that area. They say that the fish there have strange flavors, as if they had been fed with memories instead of plankton." As the sun disappeared, the sky began to fill with stars. First, timidly, and then with a splendor that can only be appreciated far from the lights of civilization. The moon, almost full, began to rise from the east, projecting a silver light that transformed the marine landscape into something dreamlike, almost supernatural. Gabriel took out a small oil lamp and lit it, creating an intimate circle of golden light in the midst of the dark vastness of the ocean. Then he extracted from his bag the scrolls that Alma had seen the night before and spread them over. A small board located next to the helm. "My grandfather believed that the reef only reveals itself completely during 3 hours, the hour before midnight, midnight itself, and the hour after," he said, studying the maps in the flickering light of the lamp. "It's as if it existed in a dimension slightly displaced from ours, and only at certain moments do both dimensions align enough to allow passage between them." Alma listened, fascinated not so much by the words themselves, which bordered on the fantastic, but by the conviction with which Gabriel pronounced them, as if he were talking about something as real and tangible as the wood under their feet, or the breeze that caressed their faces. "And how will we know we've found it?" she asked, leaning to better observe the maps. The lines, made with an ink that now seemed to glow with its own light under the lamp, showed formations that did not correspond to any known reef, spiral structures, underwater tunnels, what appeared to be chambers interconnected like those of a coral labyrinth. "The water will change," Gabriel responded. "According to my grandfather, it becomes denser, almost viscous, and acquires a phosphorescent glow, as if each drop contained a small star." His eyes reflected the fire of the lamp when he added, "And then there's the sound. A hum, almost imperceptible at first, that grows until it becomes a kind of song. Not exactly music, but something more primitive, more essential." Alma felt a shiver. That had nothing to do with the night breeze. There was something in Gabriel's description, in the way his eyes lit up when talking about the reef, that evoked images of sirens and lost navigators, of oceanic mysteries older than civilization itself. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked, although she wasn't sure if the question was directed at him or at herself. Gabriel seemed to reflect for a moment before responding, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky and sea merged into an indistinguishable darkness. "Fear is a compass," he said finally. "It doesn't point to what we should avoid, but to what we must face." The sailboat now advanced almost in silence, propelled by a constant breeze that seemed to arise from nowhere. Around them, the sea had become so calm that it perfectly reflected the starry sky, creating the illusion that they were navigating through the cosmos itself. "We're arriving," murmured Gabriel, pointing towards a point where the waters seemed darker, as if night were deeper there. "I can feel it." Alma followed his gaze, but at first she saw nothing out of the ordinary, and then she noticed it. A subtle change in the rhythm of the waves, as if they were following a cadence different from the rest of the ocean, and then something more, a fleeting flash beneath the surface so quick that she could have imagined it. "Did you see it?" asked Gabriel, using the informal "tu" for the first time, as if the proximity of the reef had also dissolved the formalities between them. Alma nodded, unable to articulate words. The shell on her chest seemed to vibrate with increasing intensity, resonating with something invisible but powerfully present in the waters that surrounded them. Gabriel collected the maps and put them away carefully, as if he no longer needed them. Then he took the lamp and turned it off, plunging the sailboat into a darkness that, paradoxically, allowed their eyes to adapt and better perceive what was happening around them. The waters had begun to emit a faint, pulsating glow, as if millions of tiny underwater fireflies were simultaneously awakening. And with the light came the sound, a low murmur, almost subliminal, that seemed to come as much from the water as from inside their own bodies. "The reef is welcoming us," whispered Gabriel, and his voice sounded different, deeper, as if he were speaking from a much greater distance than physically separated them. Alma felt something change inside her, as if layers of her being that had remained dormant for years were awakening at the contact with that strange energy. The shell on her chest no longer just vibrated. Now it emitted a comforting heat that spread throughout her body. With an almost reverential gesture, she removed it and held it in the palm of her hand. In the ghostly light of the water, the shell shone with hues that did not belong to this world. Impossible blues, greens that seemed to contain entire forests, violets that evoked sunsets on unknown planets. "It's part of it," said Gabriel, looking at the shell with amazement. "It's a fragment of the reef. Where did you find it?" "On the beach, the day I arrived in Puerto Corral," responded Alma, remembering how the small object had appeared before her, like a gift from the sea. "It was in the sand, waiting for me." Gabriel extended his hand towards the shell without touching it, as if he were feeling its energy. "The reef chose you before you knew of its existence," he murmured. "It has been calling you all this time." Alma closed her fingers around the shell, feeling its pulse. because now she was sure it pulsed like a tiny heart, synchronized with her own. "Why me?" she asked, with a voice she barely recognized as her own. The light in the water intensified, forming patterns that resembled constellations, star maps, ancient routes that connected worlds separated by vast oceans of time and space. "The reef calls to those who need to remember," responded Gabriel, and in his eyes was reflected all the mystery and magic of that place. "Those who have lost something essential and are ready to recover it." The sailboat had stopped moving, as if it had dropped invisible anchors in that sea of light. Around them, the water began to swirl slowly, forming a gentle vortex that did not inspire fear, but a strange sensation of inevitability, of return. "Are you ready?" asked Gabriel, offering her his hand. Alma looked at that extended hand, then at the luminous whirlpool that surrounded them, and finally at the shell that continued to shine in her palm like a fallen star. At that moment, all the doubts, all the fears that had accompanied her for so long seemed to dissolve in the light that emanated from the depths. She took Gabriel's hand, and together they prepared for the descent towards that place where time and memory flowed with different rules, where perhaps both would find what they had lost without knowing they were looking for it. The water wasn't cold as Alma had expected. On the contrary, it enveloped her like a warm embrace, welcoming, almost maternal. The sensation of drowning that she instinctively anticipated never came. Instead, she discovered that she could breathe, not exactly as on the surface, but in a different way, as if oxygen filtered directly through her skin, nourishing each cell of her body with a vitality she had never before experienced. They descended slowly, guided by the phosphorescent light that seemed to intensify as they sank. Both their hands remained intertwined, as if they feared getting lost in that luminous immensity where conventional spatial references had ceased to exist. There was no up or down, only a continuum of changing light and forms that appeared and disappeared at the limits of their vision. The shell, which Alma still held in her free hand, had begun to emit its own glow that created a visible path in the aqueous density that surrounded them. It was as if it were guiding them, calling them towards some specific point in the depths. Gabriel pointed ahead, and Alma saw it. The reef began to reveal itself before them in all its impossible magnificence. It didn't resemble any natural reef she had seen in photographs or documentaries. The coral formations rose like organic architectures, creating towers, arches, passages, and chambers that seemed designed with a specific purpose. The colors went beyond the usual visible spectrum, blues that seemed to contain the entire history of the ocean, reds that pulsated like planetary hearts, greens that evoked primeval forests when the earth was young. The most surprising, however, were the creatures that inhabited the reef. Fish of impossible shapes swam among the coral formations, their translucent bodies revealing internal organs that glowed with their own light. Jellyfish that seemed made of liquid memories floated in invisible currents, leaving trails that formed patterns similar to forgotten writings. And there, interwoven with the coral itself, forms that were not completely animal nor completely vegetable, but something intermediate, like thoughts that had acquired physical substance. The humming they had heard from the surface now completely surrounded them, transforming into something more complex, an aquatic symphony where each note seemed to tell a different story. Alma could feel it not only with her ears, but with her whole body, as if each vibration were activating cellular memories buried in the deepest part of her being. Gabriel looked at her, his green eyes shining with a childlike wonder that contrasted with the maturity of his features. Without words, he pointed towards an opening in the coral structure, a perfect arch that seemed to invite them to enter. Alma nodded, and together they swam towards that threshold that separated the exterior from the very heart of the reef. Upon crossing it, the sensation changed. The water became even denser, almost gelatinous, slowing their movements but also supporting them in a way that was strangely comforting. The light acquired a more intimate quality, like that of a room illuminated by candles on a winter night. They found themselves in what appeared to be a central chamber, a circular space where all the currents of the reef converged, creating a slow, hypnotic whirlpool. In the center of the chamber, suspended in nothingness, floated what at first glance seemed to be a crystal sphere the size of a human head. But as they approached, Alma saw that it wasn't crystal. It was water in its purest form, contained by some invisible force that kept it separate from the surrounding water. The shell in her hand gave a more intense pulse, as if it were recognizing something familiar. Gabriel looked at her, and in his eyes there was a silent question. Alma instinctively understood what she should do. She extended the arm that held the shell towards the aqueous sphere, feeling how the resistance of the water vanished, allowing her a fluid, natural movement. When the shell touched the surface of the sphere, it happened. It wasn't an explosion or a flash, but quite the opposite, a moment of absolute stillness, as if time itself held its breath. And then, images, not in front of her eyes, but inside them, projected directly into her consciousness, with a clarity that made any normal memory seem like a distant echo, a reflection in turbid waters. A child on a beach, building sandcastles that the sea took away, again and again, without this diminishing his enthusiasm for the ephemeral creation. The child's laughter, crystalline like spring water, mixing with the sound of the waves. A middle-aged woman, with eyes that had seen too much and loved to the same measure, collecting shells on the shore while singing an ancient melody, a lullaby perhaps in a language that Alma didn't know, but somehow perfectly understood. A storm, violent but beautiful in its unleashed fury, lashing a rocky coast where a solitary lighthouse projected its rotating light over the raging waters, a constant pulse against the chaos of the elements. Alma understood that they weren't her memories. They belonged to the reef, or rather, to all those who had been there before her, who had touched its waters and left part of themselves in them. The reef was a living repository of memories, an emotional archive of the sea, and of those who had navigated, loved, and feared it throughout the centuries. More images flowed through her. Lost civilizations, ships swallowed by storms, lovers who found refuge in secret coves, fishermen who gave their lives to the blue immensity, children who discovered the sea for the first time. Each image came loaded not only with visual information, but with pure distilled emotions that Alma experienced as her own: wonder, fear, loss, hope, love in all its possible forms. And then, unexpectedly, her own memories began to mix with those that the reef showed her. But they weren't the memories she had been jealously guarding, the ones she had revisited on sleepless nights. They were others, more deeply submerged, moments of pure joy she had forgotten, meaningful connections she had underestimated, small acts of courage and kindness that had been buried under layers of pain and disappointment. Her father, not as the distant man who populated her conscious memories, but teaching her to ride a bicycle, holding the saddle with strong but gentle hands as she pedaled, insecure at first, then with growing confidence, the expression on his face, pride, love, fear that she might get hurt, all mixed in an emotion for which there was no name. Her first immersion in the sea at 8 years old, the initial apprehension transforming into wonder when a school of silver fish surrounded her, accepting her as part of their formation, moving with her in an improvised but perfect aquatic dance. The exact moment she decided to study marine biology, sitting in the last row of a university auditorium, while a gray-haired professor projected images of underwater ecosystems, speaking with a contagious passion about the interconnection of all oceanic life. The sensation of finally finding a purpose, a direction that resonated with something deep inside her. The images continued flowing, becoming more and more personal, more intimate, showing her not only what she had lived, but what those experiences had really meant, the seeds they had planted, the ways in which they had shaped her even without her conscious knowledge. When the flow of images finally ceased, Alma found herself floating in the central chamber, with tears that mixed with the water that surrounded her. Gabriel was beside her, and by his expression she knew that he too had experienced something similar, a journey through his own depths. The shell in her hand had changed. It no longer shone with its own light, but seemed to have absorbed something from the aqueous sphere, as if it had collected fragments of the memories they had just witnessed to keep them, so they wouldn't be lost again. Gabriel pointed upward, indicating it was time to return to the surface. Alma nodded, although a part of her wished to stay longer, to immerse herself even more deeply in that ocean of shared memories. But she understood that some experiences are not designed to be prolonged, that their value lies precisely in their ephemeral nature, like the waves that the child in the first vision watched carry away his sandcastles. They began the ascent, moving through the coral structures that now seemed more alive, more aware of their presence. The impossible fish accompanied them part of the way, like an honor escort, before returning to the depths that were their home. As they approached the surface, Alma felt that something fundamental had changed within her. It wasn't a dramatic change, like a sudden conversion or a dazzling revelation. It was more subtle, deeper, as if pieces of a puzzle that she didn't even know she was trying to solve had finally found their correct places, revealing a pattern that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. When their heads broke the surface of the water, the night still enveloped the world in its starry mantle. The sailboat Esperanza waited for them, swaying gently as if they had never left. And perhaps from the perspective of linear time, that's how it had been. Perhaps the entire journey to the reef had occurred in a suspended instant, a parenthesis in the normal flow of existence. Gabriel helped her board, and both remained silent for a moment, soaked but strangely warm, as if the energy of the reef continued to flow through them. The shell, now again hanging from Alma's neck, had recovered its original appearance, although she could feel that something in its essence had changed, enriched by the shared experience. "Did you find it?" Gabriel finally asked, his voice barely audible over the soft splash of the waves against the hull. Alma didn't need to ask what he was referring to. She looked towards the now apparently normal waters, where the reef had gone back into hiding beneath the surface, invisible but present, like certain truths that are only revealed when we are prepared to see them. "I think so," she responded, feeling the weight of the shell against her chest, a comforting weight, like that of a truth finally accepted. "Or perhaps it was the one who found me." Gabriel nodded, as if the answer made perfect sense, as if paradoxes were the natural language of that place where they had immersed themselves, not only physically but also spiritually. "My grandfather used to say," he murmured, adjusting the sails to begin the return, "that the reef doesn't give answers. It only helps us remember the right questions." As the Esperanza began to move, taking them back to the coast, where the lights of Puerto Corral flickered like fallen stars, Alma felt that Gabriel's words resonated with a truth that went beyond what could be expressed with conventional language. What she had experienced in the depths wasn't an external revelation, but an inner awakening, a reunion with parts of herself that she had forgotten or abandoned in her flight forward. The return journey passed in a complicit silence, like that shared by those who have witnessed something that transcends words. Sometimes their gazes met, and, in those brief instances, Alma saw in Gabriel's eyes the reflection of her own transformation. Something fundamental had been restored. An invisible wound finally began to heal. When the coast began to define itself on the horizon, the sky to the east already showed the first signs of dawn, a timid clarity that began to dilute the darkness, promise of a new day, of a new beginning. Dawn extended its pink fingers over Puerto Corral, bathing the whitewashed houses and fishing boats in a light that made everything seem newly created, as if the world were emerging for the first time from the primeval waters. Alma and Gabriel disembarked in silence, their bodies physically exhausted but with an inner vigor that compensated for the muscular fatigue. The earliest fishermen were already on the small dock, preparing their vessels for the day. Some greeted Gabriel with the cautious familiarity reserved for outsiders, who have ceased to be completely strange without becoming one of their own. Their gazes briefly rested on Alma, with a curiosity that she felt as a tangible weight, though not hostile. "Don Mateo brings fresh octopus," commented one of them, a man with weathered skin and calloused hands, who answered to the name of Julian. "He arrived an hour ago from the southern fishing ground." Gabriel thanked him for the information with a gesture, and then looked at Alma, as if asking if she wanted to accompany him. She nodded, although what she really wanted was to return to the solitude of her house, to process everything she had experienced in the reef. But something in Gabriel's silent invitation attracted her, perhaps the promise of prolonging a little more that state of connection they had shared in the depths. The fish market of Puerto Corral was little more than a series of improvised stalls under canvases discolored by the sun, but it teemed with life and color. Fishermen and vendors shouted the prices and qualities of their products, while local housewives bargained with the fierceness of generals in battle. The smell of salt, fresh fish, and aromatic herbs permeated the air, creating an olfactory symphony that was strangely comforting. Don Mateo, a man advanced in years with a patch over his left eye and a white beard that gave him the appearance of a marine prophet, greeted Gabriel like an old friend. "The scientist returns from his explorations," he said with a smile that revealed more absences than teeth. "Did you find what you were looking for this time?" The question, apparently casual, had an undertone that did not escape Alma. Did the old fisherman know something about the reef? Was he part of the local guardians of that secret? Gabriel smiled enigmatically. "Let's say the sea was generous," he responded, then pointing towards the octopuses that rested on a bed of crushed ice. "How much for 2 portions?" While Gabriel negotiated the price, Alma observed her surroundings, seeing the market and the town with new eyes. After the experience in the reef, everything seemed to contain an additional dimension, as if she could perceive not only the immediate reality, but also the stories that beat beneath the surface of each person, each object, each exchange. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, approached her with the uninhibited curiosity of childhood. She wore a flowery dress and held in her hands a small clay bowl full of tiny shells, similar to the one Alma wore around her neck. "Do you also collect treasures from the sea?" asked the girl, pointing to the pearly shell. Alma squatted to be at her height, moved by the question that seemed to contain a wisdom that went beyond the age of who formulated it. "This was a gift," she responded, gently touching the shell. "Are yours also gifts?" The girl nodded with seriousness. "The sea leaves them on the sand every morning," she explained, as if she were sharing an important secret. "Mama says they are messages in very small bottles that we can only read if we learn the language of the waves." Something in those words touched a deep fiber in Alma, as if they contained a fundamental truth that she had glimpsed in the depths of the reef. "Your mother is very wise," she said, smiling at the girl. "Lucia, come here," called a woman from one of the nearby stalls. "Stop bothering the lady." "She's not bothering at all," assured Alma, standing up. "She has a precious collection." The woman, who shared with the girl the same dark, vivacious eyes, observed Alma with interest. "You're the one who lives in the house on the North Beach, right?" she asked, with the direct familiarity of small communities where everyone knows everyone's movements. Alma nodded, surprised to be recognized when she had barely interacted with the town's inhabitants during her 6 months there. "I'm Elena," the woman introduced herself, extending a hand weathered by work but surprisingly soft. "My husband is a fisherman. Sometimes he passes near your house when returning from the eastern fishing ground." There was something in Elena's eyes, a genuine warmth that made Alma feel a pang of remorse for her self-imposed isolation. How many potential connections had she avoided in her determination to stay apart, to lick her wounds in private? "Alma," she responded, shaking the offered hand. "A pleasure to meet you both." Gabriel approached then, carrying a package wrapped in newspaper that contained the freshly bought octopus. "I see you've already met Elena and little Lucia," he commented. "Elena makes the best coconut bread in all of Puerto Corral." The woman smiled at the compliment. "You exaggerate, as always," she said, and then, addressing Alma, added, "You should come someday to the full moon celebration. The whole town gathers in the square. There's music, food, stories. It's our small way of thanking the sea for its bounties." "Full moon celebration?" asked Alma, feeling a tingle of curiosity. "It's tonight, in fact," responded Gabriel. "It coincides with the end of the storm season and the beginning of the best period for fishing." Elena nodded. "Some say it's just an excuse to drink rum and dance," she commented with a conspiratorial smile, "but the oldest in the town insist it's a necessary ritual, that it maintains the balance between us and the sea." "The sea has its rules, its cycles," intervened Don Mateo, who had silently approached the group. "The ancients knew it. We just keep the tradition alive, although few remember its true meaning." There was something in the way the old fisherman looked at Alma, an evaluating intensity, as if he were trying to determine if she was worthy of some secret knowledge. "You should attend, miss," he added, gesturing towards the shell that hung from her neck. "Perhaps you'll find answers to questions you don't yet know you have." Before Alma could respond, Lucia gently tugged at her dress. "Will you come?" she asked, with the simplicity of one who doesn't conceive of a negative as a possible answer. "I tell stories of mermaids and sunken ships. They're very good." Alma looked at the girl, then at Elena, at Don Mateo, and finally at Gabriel, who watched her with an expectant but not pressuring expression, as if he perfectly understood the internal conflict she was experiencing, the desire to maintain her protective bubble against the growing need for connection that the reef had awakened in her. "I would love to attend," she finally said, surprising herself with the sincerity that imbued her words. Lucia's face lit up with a smile that seemed to contain all the joy in the Chow world. "I'll save you a place by the fire," she exclaimed, before running off among the market stalls with her bowl of shells firmly held against her chest. Elena smiled, thanking Alma with a warm gesture, and then returned to her stall where several customers waited to buy the coconut bread for which she was apparently famous. Don Mateo, after a nod that seemed to contain both approval and warning, also withdrew, leaving Alma and Gabriel alone again in the midst of the market bustle. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," said Gabriel as they walked back towards the beach. "The people of Puerto Corral understand the need for space." Alma breathed deeply, feeling the salty air fill her lungs, bringing with it smells of life and human activity that, strangely, no longer seemed as overwhelming as before. "I want to go," she responded, surprised by the firmness of her own voice. I think I've been alone long enough." Gabriel looked at her with an expression that mixed understanding and something more, something that Alma couldn't or perhaps didn't want to name yet. "I'll pick you up at nightfall then," he said simply. They reached the fork where their paths separated, his towards the small dock where the Esperanza was moored, hers towards the solitary house on the north beach. They stopped for a moment, enveloped in a silence that seemed to contain entire conversations. "Thank you," Alma finally said, although she herself wasn't sure exactly what she was thanking for the adventure in the reef, for the invitation to the celebration, for not pressuring her, for appearing at her door during the storm, perhaps for all of that and more. Gabriel nodded, as if he perfectly understood the breadth of that gratitude. "Until tonight," he responded, handing her the package with the octopus. "For lunch, Don Mateo says it should be cooked with a little white wine and fresh herbs." Alma took the package, feeling the comforting weight of something tangible, real, after the almost dreamlike experience of the reef. Her fingers brushed Gabriel's in the exchange, and that brief contact seemed to contain echoes of the deeper connection they had shared under the waters. As she watched him walk away towards the dock, Alma felt something settle within her, like sediments after a storm that slowly find their place on the seabed, creating new contours, new possibilities. The shell on her chest seemed lighter now, not a weight to bear, but an anchor. That connected her both to the depths and to the surface, with steps that no longer sought to avoid encounters, but that began to open to new possibilities. Alma set out towards her house, where the solitude that awaited her no longer seemed like a refuge, but a transitional space, a bridge between who she had been and who she was beginning to be. Alma spent the rest of the day in a state of strange lucidity, as if each object, each sound, each ray of light that entered through the windows of her small house were imbued with a new and deeper meaning. She cooked the octopus following Don Mateo's instructions, finding an unexpected pleasure in the ritual gestures of preparation, the slow bubbling of the broth, the aroma of herbs when crushed, the transformation of the mollusk from a rubbery consistency to a tender texture that melted in the mouth. She ate sitting on the porch, observing the sea that now seemed both closer and more mysterious to her after her immersion in the reef. The waves followed their immemorial rhythm, but Alma saw them with new eyes, aware of the stories they transported, of the memories they kept in their depths. In the middle of the afternoon, she surprised herself doing something she hadn't done in months, looking for something specific to wear. Her wardrobe, austere and functional like the rest of her life in Puerto Corral, offered few options beyond the linen pants and cotton shirts that constituted her daily uniform. But at the bottom, carefully, folded and almost forgotten, she found a dress she had brought almost by accident, a remnant of her previous life. It was simple but beautiful, in a deep blue that recalled the sea in calm, with small details embroidered in silver thread that caught the light like fish scales. She put it on and observed herself in the small mirror that hung next to the door, surprised by the woman who looked back at her. There was something different in her eyes, a spark she thought lost, an openness towards possibilities she had ceased to consider. "You're returning," she murmured to her reflection, and the woman in the mirror seemed to nod in silent agreement. She ate breakfast frugally, more out of routine than hunger, and then left the house, closing the door without a key, as she had learned to do in this place where trust was not naive, but a practical form of community life. Instead of heading towards the town, or towards the dock where she usually met Gabriel, Alma walked in the opposite direction, towards a stretch of coast she rarely visited. It was a more rugged area, where cliffs rose abruptly from the sea, creating a natural barrier that few ventured to explore. The path was barely visible, probably formed by fishermen who occasionally sought elevated points to spot schools of fish, or perhaps by local teenagers in search of private places for their first romances. As she ascended, the vegetation became sparser, dominated by resistant plants that tenaciously clung to the rock with roots that seemed more determined than reasonable. The wind was stronger up here, laden with salt and oceanic promises. Alma breathed deeply, letting it fill her lungs, penetrate every cell of her body like an invisible but deep cleansing. When she reached the top of the cliff, she stopped, impressed by the view that stretched before her. From that height, the sea seemed infinite, a canvas of changing blues that merged with the sky in a horizon impossible to define with precision. Below, the waves rhythmically beat against the rocks, creating explosions of white foam that contrasted with the deep blue, as if the ocean were constantly applauding its own greatness. Alma sat on a flat rock, perfectly positioned like a natural seat, oriented towards the immensity. The shell on her chest now beat with such force that she could almost hear it above the constant rumor of the sea and wind. She took it between her hands, studying once more its perfect spirals, the nacreous quality, that constantly changed tone depending on the angle of light, revealing colors that did not seem to belong completely to this world. "Now I understand," she said aloud, although there was no one who could hear her except the seagulls that lazily glided on the ascending currents. "You're not mine to keep. You never were." The shell pulsed in response, as if confirming her words. Alma carefully untied the cord from which the shell hung, holding it in the palm of her hand, feeling its light but significant weight, like that of certain truths that seem simple once discovered, but that carry the weight of profound transformations. She stood up, approaching the edge of the cliff, where the wind was even stronger, almost as if trying to push her back, away from the precipice. But Alma stood firm, her feet planted securely on the rock, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sea and sky merged in a perfect communion. "Thank you," she whispered to the shell, and through it, to the reef, to the sea, to all the visible and invisible forces that had guided her to this moment. For finding me when I was lost, for showing me a way back, not to who I was, but to who I can be. With a fluid movement, Alma extended her arm and opened her hand, releasing the shell. For an instant it seemed suspended in the air, catching the sunlight in an almost blinding flash. Then, instead of falling directly towards the rocks below, the shell seemed to be caught by an invisible current, tracing a descending spiral, moving away from the cliffs towards deeper waters. Alma observed, fascinated, how the small object shone as it descended, like a star falling in slow motion, until it finally touched the surface of the water and disappeared beneath the waves, with barely a concentric circle that briefly expanded, before being absorbed by the constant movement of the sea. At the exact moment the shell disappeared, Alma felt something change within her. It wasn't dramatic like a door opening or a light turning on, but more subtle, like when a familiar room is reorganized while we sleep. Everything is still there, but in a new order that somehow feels more correct, more harmonious. She instinctively brought her hand to her chest, where the shell had rested for so long. Although it was no longer physically there, she could feel its presence in a different way, as if it had been internalized, becoming part of her at a deeper level than mere physical contact. "The reef within me," she murmured, finally understanding what perhaps had been true from the beginning. She remained on the cliff until the sun reached its zenith, bathing the landscape in a light that seemed to reveal the true nature of each object, each contour, each shadow. Then, with light but determined steps, she began the descent, feeling that although the shell had returned to the sea, something equally valuable had remained with her. The ability to see connections where before she only saw separation, to find meaning in the apparently chaotic flow of life, to recognize that certain losses are actually necessary transformations. When she reached the beach, she saw Gabriel waiting in the distance, standing next to the Esperanza that swayed gently in the calm waters near the small dock. He didn't seem impatient or worried, but simply present, as if he understood that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. As she approached him, Alma immediately noticed that his expression changed, not dramatically but subtly, like someone who recognizes a fundamental change in a loved one. "You returned it to the sea," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of a fact that somehow he already knew. Alma nodded, instinctively bringing her hand to her chest where the shell had rested for so long. "It was the right thing," she responded. "What I had to do." Gabriel smiled, a smile that contained understanding, respect, and something more, something that Alma was beginning to recognize as love, although neither of them had yet pronounced that word, letting it flourish at its own pace, like certain marine plants that only fully open under precise conditions of light and current. "My grandfather used to say that everything the sea gives eventually must return to it," he commented, extending a hand to help her board the sailboat. "But it returns transformed, enriched by its time in the outer world." Alma took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin weathered by the sun and salt. "Do you think the shell has changed?" she asked, allowing him to help her board. "That it's different now that it has been with me?" Gabriel looked into her eyes with an intensity that seemed to reach directly to her center. "I believe it has absorbed your story, your essence," he responded, "and that it will carry it with it back to the reef, where it will become part of the collective memory of the ocean." The idea was both amazing and perfectly logical, like all the truths that Alma had discovered since her arrival in Puerto Corral, that the sea was not just a mass of water, but a living being, conscious in its own way, capable of keeping memories, of establishing connections, of sending messengers like the shell for those who needed to be remembered or to remember. "Where are we going today?" she asked, noting that Gabriel had prepared the sailboat as for a longer excursion than usual. There were provisions, blankets, even a small folding telescope secured next to the helm. "Wherever you want," he responded, with a smile that suggested he already had a pretty clear idea of what her choice would be. "The sea is calm, the wind is favorable, and we have until tomorrow." Alma looked towards the horizon, where the blue of the sea merged with that of the sky in a line impossible to define with precision. She knew exactly where she wanted to go, and suspected that Gabriel knew it too. "To the reef," she said, feeling a mixture of anticipation and serenity at the prospect of returning to that magical place, but this time not as someone who seeks, but as someone who returns, who completes a circle. "I want to see if the shell found its way back." Gabriel nodded, as if he had been expecting exactly that answer, and began to prepare the sails with the efficiency of someone who has made these movements thousands of times until they've become second nature. "The moon will be almost full tonight," he commented, while Alma helped him, now familiar with the routines of the sailboat. "It's a good time to visit the reef." The Esperanza glided smoothly away from the coast, propelled by a constant breeze that seemed to arise specifically to facilitate their journey. From the beach, Alma saw Lucia, who had appeared from somewhere, and now bid them farewell with enthusiastic gestures. The girl held something up high, her bowl of shells probably, as if she were offering it to the sea in her own private ritual. As they moved away, Puerto Corral reduced until it became a collection of white dots against the green of the coastal vegetation, then a barely perceptible line on the horizon, and finally disappeared completely, leaving them alone in the blue immensity, where the sky and water created the illusion of sailing through infinity itself. Alma sat at the bow, letting the sea breeze caress her face and play with her hair, while Gabriel handled the helm with the quiet confidence of one who intimately knows the whims of the sea and wind. They didn't talk much, it wasn't necessary. There was a comfort in their shared silence that said more than any conversation. The sun began its descent towards the west, transforming the waters into a mirror of liquid gold. In the distance, a group of dolphins briefly jumped above the surface, their shining bodies catching the golden light before submerging again. Alma observed them, remembering how, in her previous life, she would have immediately taken out a camera, tried to capture the moment, preserve it. Now she simply lived it, trusting that the memory of her heart would keep it in a way that no image could replicate. When the sun finally touched the horizon, Gabriel reduced the speed of the sailboat, orienting it towards a point that for Alma seemed indistinguishable from the rest of the ocean that surrounded them, but that he seemed to recognize with the certainty of one who follows an invisible map engraved in his memory. "We'll arrive just after nightfall," he said, joining her at the bow after securing the helm. "When the moon begins to rise from the east." Alma nodded, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and nostalgia. The last time they had been here, the shell had guided her, had been her anchor and her compass in the depths. Now she returned without it, or perhaps, as she had begun to understand, with it integrated in a deeper and more permanent way. "Do you think it will be different this time?" she asked, while they shared a simple dinner of bread, cheese, and fruits. Observing the last rays of the sun disappear below the horizon, Gabriel reflected for a moment before responding, his green eyes reflecting the sky that now was tinted with purples and indigos. "The reef is never the same twice," he said finally. "Like the sea, like us, it's in constant change, but its essence remains." They finished dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, while darkness gradually enveloped the Esperanza, turning it into a small island of consciousness, floating in an ocean of mystery. When the moon began to rise, its silver light created a bright path over the waters, like an invitation, a path towards the unknown. Gabriel turned off the lamps of the sailboat, allowing only the lunar light to illuminate them, revealing his face in silver tones and deep shadows that accentuated the bone structure of his features, making him seem older, almost mythical. "It's time," he said softly, pointing towards a point where the waters seemed darker, as if night were deeper there. "The reef is awakening." Alma felt it before seeing it, a subtle change in the density of the air, in the way the water hit against the hull of the sailboat, in gravity itself that seemed to slightly alter. Then she saw it, a faint glow beneath the surface, like millions of underwater stars beginning to light simultaneously. The sailboat stopped by itself, as if it had dropped invisible anchors at that exact point, where everyday reality began to dissolve into something more fluid, more malleable. The glow under the water intensified, and with it came that sound that Alma remembered. Not exactly music, but something more primordial, a pulse, a heartbeat that seemed to resonate directly inside her body. Gabriel approached her, offering his hand in a gesture that was both question and invitation. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes shining with reflections of the light that emanated from the depths. Alma took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin, the calloused testimony of years of sailing, the human anchor that now complemented the one the shell had previously provided. "Ready," she responded, and together they immersed themselves in the luminous waters of the reef. Not as visitors this time, but as those who return to a long-awaited home. Pay attention, the story is long. There will be a second part.